much. All right, so we are back in the book of Galatians, and I just have one question, and then I'll recap Galatians for us because we've slept a little bit since then. So as we get back in, just one question. Second Sunday of your 2020. Did anybody write out like a purpose statement for 2020? Anybody? Oh, okay. There's two of us. Actually, I should probably put my hand down. I didn't either. So that's a thing, right? So we were gathering last night with neighborhood groups, and somebody said that they just prayed for a couple of words from the Lord. It's not a statement, but a word to give them some direction for this new year. And what a beautiful thing. So for all of us, except for the two of us that raised our hand, kind of like this after they realized no one else was, for all of us, Paul is going to put a purpose statement on us today. And it's not just a man named Paul, but God himself. He's going to put a purpose statement on us. And so for anybody that's ever done purpose statements or a word, so like my word last year was self-control. I don't have that this year. Maybe it's intentionality. I'm not really sure. But like if you've gotten something like that, or you've purposed something like a purpose statement, then you know that you're gonna have some opposition. Some of you have goals, if not a purpose statement for this new year. You're going to face some opposition if you haven't already. I know for all of us at the Grove, we're trying to become a people that are praying more. And so we put together this prayer calendar, and you have opportunity to pray every day. And now we're 12 days in, and those first few days started with a lot of resolve to pray, no matter what. If it took 5 minutes, great. If it took 15 minutes, awesome. No matter what it took, we were going to do it. And then about day 4, you just start to kind of that resolve wanes a bit, right? 12 days in, we are still trying to figure out, oh yeah, that's right, that was my thing that I was going to do. And so whether it be reading or praying, we have some goals, whatever it may be, or maybe losing weight, or maybe it's getting a different job, or whatever it may be. Like that's the thing that's kind of purposing us. As we purpose to do those things, we know we're going to face opposition. But what if there was a greater purpose for us that Paul's going to give us? What even greater opposition will we face? But my question for us is, what would you do and what are you doing in order to fulfill those purposes? Maybe some of us are not as intentional as we need to some 12 days in, but maybe this is a call to kind of get back on the wagon, so to speak. To pursue the things that you were saying, that I think we were saying, that God calls us to do in this new year. So what is this purpose that Paul is calling for all of us? And I would say this, it's better than losing weight. It involves praying and reading. It's better than finding that career that you've been hoping for. Instead, it's right there at the end of this passage in verse 19. Until Christ is formed in you. Until Christ is formed in you. You see, that's the purpose statement that God's putting on all of us, whether we go to the Grove or not, whether that's it. Like as Christians, that's the purpose statement for our lives, 2020, 2030, 2080. It doesn't matter. That Christ be formed in you. So what opposition is there going to be for Christ's formation in you? A little or a lot? A lot. What are you willing then to do to purpose towards Christ being formed in you? Hopefully, whatever it takes. Just like it would be for losing weight or becoming a person of prayer or whatever it may be. How much more then for Christ to be formed in you? If you're a parent in this room, you feel the weight of the passage today. Like you feel the weight of caring for someone to be formed, to grow up from one stage to the next. And you're praying and you're longing for Christ to be formed in your children. And if Christ is already in them, then you're longing for them to grow up in the faith. And to put on even more of what God calls us to put on. But I would say this, like maybe that's you in the past, that you've already done your parenting thing. For most of us in the room, we're still in the midst of trying to figure out, like, can I get enough sleep? Much less can I do X, Y, or Z with my kids? So my prayer for us is that we would put this passage kind of in our pocket, or better yet, that we would allow this passage to get into us, because Paul is longing for his children in the faith to not just grow up, but to live in their purpose, and that purpose to be Christ be formed in them. So if you're a parent, great, you see this. If you're not a parent, or you've already kind of finished with your parenting task or your main parenting task, if you lead anything, particularly spiritual matters, man, I pray that this would be a purpose statement for us, and it would align us for what matters. Before we get there, let me recap Galatians. And I'm going to do that just by reading a few passages and maybe just giving a bit of commentary so we can understand what Paul has said so far. Because if we read Galatians 4:8 through 20, we might just miss the whole point. Because there's not a ton of theology in today. Although there's a lot, but there's not a ton of stated theology in today. And so let's kind of see this big picture as to the picture that Paul is painting for this church in Galatia. If you remember, Paul planted this church, and it was many churches in the region of Galatia. It was a new church plant. These were new believers that had only been going for maybe months, if not more than just a year or so. And it wasn't long before false teachers came behind Paul and said, yeah, Paul's a good guy. We really like him, but he's afraid to tell you the whole truth. And so let's look at some of the things that he says in response to this accusation that Paul's afraid of them, or at least he's not telling them the whole truth. So we started this many months ago in chapter 1, verse 6, right? I am astonished. This is how Paul starts. I am astonished. I'm amazed. I'm shocked that you are so quickly deserting him who called you in the grace of Christ, and you're now turning to a different gospel. Not that there is another gospel, but there are some who trouble you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to the one we preach to you, then let him be accursed. As we've said before, so now I say again, if anyone is preaching to you a gospel contrary to the one you have received, let him be accursed. And so as the false teachers come through, he's clearly addressing them, that they're preaching a different gospel. That this guy Paul, he's afraid to disappoint you. That you actually do need to get circumcised. You do need to put on some of the Jewish laws of seasons and harvest festivals. And if those things, then how much more the whole law? And Paul responds, right? In verse 10 and 11, 10 and 11. For am I now seeking the approval of man or of God? Am I now trying to please man? If I were still trying to please man, I would not be a servant of Christ. No, instead, verse 11, for I would have you know, brothers, that the gospel that was preached by me is not man's gospel. No, it came from God. And so we skip ahead, and this is what Paul's main purpose is to make sure they understand and live the gospel and trust the God of the gospel. And so they go into chapter 2, right? And Paul is defending his ministry. We go into verse 16 of chapter 2. And this is the gospel. Yet we know that a person is not justified by works, made right with God by works of the law, of this God-given Mosaic, like a whole that God gave them. No one is made right with God by following that law, but through faith. Through faith in Jesus Christ. So we also have believed in Christ Jesus in order to be made right with God by faith in Christ, not by the works of the law, because by works of the law, no one will be justified. Doesn't matter how good you think you are, how closely you adhere to any good or godly law, those are the things that will not make you right with God, but instead, the righteous works of Jesus on your behalf and your faith in those works. What a beautiful thing that faith would be given as a gift from God to be able to trust God for these things. And so he's putting down this beautiful gospel message, and yet he keeps getting distracted with their unfaithfulness to it. Not distracted, but purposed by it. And so in verse 1 of chapter 3, he goes on to say, "Oh, foolish Galatians, who's cast a spell on you?" This is the sermon that we preached right before Halloween, right? That there was this spooky spell in the church. And that spooky spell is that we would trust anything other than Christ. We would believe in this merit system that we would have with God. Who has bewitched you? It was before your eyes that Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified. Go down to verse 3. Are you so foolish, having begun by the Spirit? Are you now being perfected by the flesh? Of course not. And then he would go on in chapter 4 to tell us all and to continue to plead with us all that if we want to be blessed, if we want to partake in the blessings of God, we need nothing else besides Christ. If We want to become like the best Jew that there ever was, Jesus. He follows in the line of Abraham. And so surely we would want to be like Abraham. We want to be like Abraham, be a man of faith. Be a woman of faith. So at the end of this really challenging first half of the book, right? This is where we landed on Christmas Eve in verse 4, chapter 4. It says this, all the way to 7, until we get to the passage we started with today. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, in a perfect time, exactly how God determined it, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a son, and of a son, then an heir through God. Seems clear, right? And yet if we can identify with the Galatians at all, what we will find is that just like they do, so do we fall back again and again in relying in our own goodness, in relying on good works that we can do to feel right with God. And what Paul is telling us today is that that's slavery. That your attendance, if you are relying, I met with a church this week, and they did a survey in their church, and they said 50% of their church believes that the ultimate goal of the Christian life is showing up on Sunday. That's half of us. If we were to take that statistic and apply it to us, it may not be 50, but there's a percentage. That if we are relying on the attendance, if we're relying on a prayer, on a baptism, on communion, on anything other than the works of Christ, we are enslaved to really good things, but not God. And so Paul is calling for us to get out of that slavery, right? And in so doing, he has 3 statements or questions of concern that he is calling us to hold on to this purpose statement of Christ being formed in us. And as he does so, this passage is formed by 3 statements of concern that I want us to see, because I think it frames our time for all of us, right? So his 3 concerns, his statements or questions of concern they start in verse 11, right? And these questions, I've got to tell you, like a good leader will state their concerns for their people. That's just a part of good leadership. And Paul's words reveal that the Galatians' behavior is gutting him personally. As a leader, he is being gutted by the faithful disobedience of the people that he is leading. I don't know if you've ever felt this way, but it's certainly part of I would say this, if it's not a part of our Christian experience, whether we're parenting or leading others, where we've just been gutted by someone else's continual, habitual sin, man, we need to get in it. We need to get in the game. If that's not a part of our Christian experience, then we're Christianing wrong. That's what Paul is going to lead us into, that we have got to be caring for one another on some level to where we are gutted when things go poorly. Not just in our own lives, but when the people that we love end up walking away, that it guts us. So this is the first question, right, or the first statement in verse 11. It says this, like listen to the tears and the anguish of Paul. I'm afraid that I have labored over you in vain. I'm afraid that all my hard work has proven empty. And more than that, Paul is saying, I'm terrified for you. I'm afraid for you. You're in danger. Paul is telling his church that they are in danger when they have habitual, continual disobedience. When you set out for someone to go, and this is the way to life, this is the way to Christ, and they go, thank you for your opinion, I'm still going to go this way, there's a danger in that. And Paul is easily saying, I fear for you. He's not much concerned about the labor that he has, although he is now reminded of it. Instead, his main concern is for his hearers. Second concern in verse 16 says this, have I now become your enemy by telling you the truth? By somehow revealing to you that which is right and wrong, and you continually going the wrong way, that now all of a sudden you're going to blame me for that? And he says, like in context, man, when I first came to the region in Galatia, whatever physical ailment he had to stop in Galatia and minister to them. And when he did, he shared the gospel and they received the good news. And they became so committed to Paul, although they could have easily seen his physical ailment as a reason to deny him, which would have been normal in that culture. Instead, Paul testifies, you loved me so much that you would have taken your eyeballs out for me. That's how closely and kindred we once were. What happened? Because I told you the truth, now you're ready to disown me? Man, what happened? What happens to us? How do we respond when someone pleads with you with the truth? Do they become your enemy because you don't want to hear the truth? Do you use excuses like, man, I can't believe you did that over text? I mean, isn't that a sly excuse to just not receive the truth? And yet, this is the ancient text. This is like not limited to 140 characters because our texts aren't limited to that anymore, or our tweets. But isn't that what Paul says at the end of this? Like, I'm perplexed. I wish I could change my tone with you. I wish I could be with you in person, but that's not possible. And so I got to do what I can do, and that is to speak the truth to you even while away. And so that's the last statement of concern. In verse 20, he says this, like, man, I wish I could be present with you now and change my tone, for I am perplexed about you. I'm without words. I don't even know what to do with this anymore. And so for all of us, me too, like, be careful when all of a sudden your leader just doesn't have anything to say to you anymore. That they've done all that they can do. They've said all that they can say, and you're still purposed towards that direction. And so that leader, just like we read in Romans 1 during confession time, that like at some point, God just gives you up to your own desires. And so your leader, if he or she is reading the scriptures, at some point you're just going to be, I've done all I can do. I'm perplexed. I'm without words. So do your thing, man. Go run into trouble. I can't help. You got to care about this more than me. These are the three concerns that are framing this passage. That's why I wanted to kind of get us back into all of Galatians, because it's like, dude, that's like a heavy entrance here, buddy. And yet Paul is not deterred. Why? What causes any leader, what causes Paul to continue to voice his concerns with the Galatians? Why is he so gutted? Why is he so caught up in emotion? Because our greatest danger, friends, our greatest danger is deception. And Paul is continuing to plead with his hearers and say, you are deceived. And they would say to him, do you think I'm lying to you? And he would say, no, you're not lying. I think you're actually telling your version of the truth. But the problem is, you're being deceived to think that the truth is a lie. And the lie is the truth, just like Adam and Eve, right? Our ancestors in the faith of Adam and Eve, those that heard the words of God directly, and then all of a sudden the serpent comes in and goes, did God really say that? It's deception. It's not anti-truth, it's just a twisting of the truth. And the Galatians, much like all of us, me too, it's not like we're denying Jesus when we go and sin, not inherently or overtly. Instead, it's just like we're just taking a 4-degree difference. I don't know, maybe just a little sin here or there. I'm not going to deny him altogether. I still love Jesus, but I still also want to fiddle in these things. And so there's this great danger for the Galatians, right? And this is why the scriptures tell us that believing wrong things to be right things is a dangerous thing. 1 John 4:1 would say this about testing the spirits. For all of us in the room, beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits. Test them, examine them to see whether they are from God. For many false prophets have gone out into the world. 2 Corinthians 11:13 and 14 talks about these false apostles, that not everyone is to be trusted. For such men are false apostles, deceitful workmen, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. And no wonder, for look at Satan's main purpose. He disguises himself as an angel of light, aka he looks like the right way to go. Everything about it looks correct, but it's not. Test it. Test it by the truth. What does this all mean? It means that Satan's greatest strategy has always been and will always be to get you thinking it's no big deal in your life. No big deal to sin. Just a little bit of this, a little bit of that, whatever you want to place in there. It's no big deal. And the people that might call you out for it, man, they're really zealous. And actually, they're not even just zealous, they're judgmental. I don't want to be around that. See, that's the deception that we have. And for the Galatians, it was no big deal to add a little good works to Jesus' work. The believers there thought it a small thing to incorporate just a little good works and add them to Jesus' works, to become Jewish, to become like Jesus after all. And for them, it was to get circumcised. And in verses 8 through 10, it talks about, man, you even are practicing all of the different seasons and the days and the years. And he tells them, right? But you are enslaved. Let me just read verses 8 through 10 again. Formerly, when you did not know God, there was a time when you didn't know God. You worshiped all kinds of gods. You were enslaved to those that by nature are not gods. But now that you have come to know God, or rather known by God, how can you turn back again to the weak and worthless elementary principles of the world? Whose slaves do you want to become once more? You observe days and months and seasons and years. Man, I'm afraid I have labored over you in vain. Paul's concern, God's concern for us, that if you gain confidence from 1 ounce of one work, you are rejecting the full work of Jesus. And there's danger in this, friends. See, this small turn was going to lead them into disastrous results. And so Paul steps in, reminds them of their reality. This is what mattered so much to Paul. It mattered so much to Paul that he corrected himself. See the subtlety that even Paul is writing through in verse 9. That like as expensive and as precious as the material that they wrote on and the instruments with which they wrote, it was precious, it was limited, and yet Paul thought it valuable enough to clarify his own words. And I think there's a great clarity for us as well. Like, how often does the Bible correct itself? Or at least clarify itself. It's not correcting, it's clarifying itself. Verse 9, look what it says. But now that you have come to know God, actually, that gives you too much credit. Instead, you have been known by God. This is the heart of the deception. Will you rely on the things that you do to know God? Knowing God's a good thing, right? We must be still and know that He is God. Like, there's a responsibility in that, but that is not where we find our hope. Instead, our hope is found, is what we sang, in nothing less than Jesus Christ and His righteousness. Our hope is found not that we know Him, but that the Creator of all things, the one that numbered the stars in the sky, created all the galaxies of which there are billions, knows you. That's where our hope is found. I had a text conversation with a friend of mine this week, not at the Grove, and literally out of the blue, he texted me and he goes, "Why do we prefer to eat boogers when God gives us filet mignon?" And I was like, dude, great to hear from you. Happy New Year. Also, like, isn't that true? Why? No, just a Carol. She's the mother of many boys. That's why she knows this is true. Right? This is it. Like, there's this truth that's being pulled out of us that we sometimes would prefer to rely on the things that make us feel good about ourselves, rather than being known by God, because this is where our pride is stripped down. That we can't rely on our prayer or our baptism or whatever language you use, but instead that we rely on being known by the Creator of all things, intimately. And He's not your boss and you're not His employee. He's your dad. He's your Abba, your daddy. And that's the relationship that He's initiated, established, sustained in you. Just no one can break out of the grip of God, that He would come and that we would be known by Him. That what a great clarification that Paul makes in verse 9. But now that you have come to know God as opposed to all the other gods, which aren't really gods at all, and instead the one true God now knows you. You have been known by God and a passive recipient of God's grace. And Paul's warning is that we're in slavery if we rely on the things to know God. And so the danger is here. The danger is this. Just like in Colossians 1, it says that we are either in one kingdom or another. You cannot straddle the fence of two kingdoms. That is not the posture of a Christian. If you're in this room and you are straddling the fence of two kingdoms, let me break this down for you. It's the dominion of darkness where Satan reigns and rules. That's one. And the other kingdom, the kingdom of his beloved Son, where there's nothing but life. Difficulty? Yes. But life in the difficulty and purpose that Christ be formed in us. Deception, thinking you're going the right way when you're actually going into a long grave of life. Over here, the life that leads to life. The kingdom of the wonderful Son, or the dominion of darkness, as Colossians 1 talks about. We cannot be in both. No matter what your new teachers say, Paul is saying to the Galatians. So at this point in my preparation, I kept going like, how could they continue on in their deception? How could they not see what was going on? And that's the thing about deception, right? Is you can't see it. You don't know that you're being deceived, otherwise you wouldn't be doing it. You think it's the truth. And so you need a brother, you need a sister to be able to come in and speak a word of encouragement, of correction even. Right? I think that we kind of give in to this AT&T commercial, like just okay is not okay. Like we're okay with just being okay. It's a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Yeah, I try to follow Jesus. I mean, I go to church on Sunday, but like, don't tell me what to do on Friday or Saturday. That's crazy town. Right? Or on Monday at work. Instead, being okay is not okay, as our great AT&T people had to say. Instead, it takes a brother and a sister to courageously point out to us where we are being deceived and what's going on. Because the Galatians, in Paul's absence, new teachers had come in, and this was their strategy. So beware of this strategy, friends. If you don't end up at the Grove and this is not your home, cool. Go find a place that the leaders will be gutted over disobedience in your life. That they would know about disobedience in your life. That they care about the holy things. Right? That's what God is calling us to do, not to fill up our calendar, our social calendar for X, Y, or Z, but to be purposed. That Christ be formed in you. Christ be formed in them. Right? This is what their strategy was in verse 17. Let's read it together. Look at what these teachers do. Look, have I become your enemy by telling you the truth? Look what they've done, Paul is saying. They're going to make accusations against me. Then I want you to see what they're doing in their deception. They make much of you. They flatter you. They kiss you all the time. They love you. Man, you're doing such a good job. Love you, bro. But for no good purpose. Well, what do you mean? They want to shut you out from the bride of Christ that you may make much of them. False teachers create a system of codependence. There's two ways they do it: emotional codependence and theological codependence. And so emotional codependence looks like this, right? That your well-being is dependent upon performance plus acceptance. And so if you just do the right things in the right way, they'll love you. That's emotional codependence of what false teachers are all about. But there's also this theological codependence that you cannot figure out how to do life apart from their special secret sauce that they're going to give you once a week. And so all of a sudden they make much of personality. They make much of really just like trying to do the right thing at the right time all the time. And all of a sudden Jesus takes a back seat. And those teachers are more interested in building a crowd than following Jesus. And so Paul is saying, man, like, be aware of really good things that take you away from purposing to follow Jesus so that Christ may be formed in you. You and I could have the greatest marriage in the world. Our kids could turn out to be scholars at Harvard. My kids cannot, but your kids might be scholars at Harvard. No offense, Reese or Ellie or Moses. It's just you came from me, and that's just the way it is. Right? Reese, Don't look at her right now. Risha's like, okay, I guess I'm going to go to the Harvard of the South. That'd be A&M. All right. But nonetheless, right? Like that, they could be the greatest students. They could go off and do the greatest things. Work for NASA and discover a new planet on the third day of your new internship, which happened this week. They could do all those things, and it would matter not if not for Christ being formed in them. And so, if not for them, and if that's the case for them, how much more for you? That Christ be formed in you. So after all this heartache, after all the deception and danger, why would Paul continue to even write a letter like this? Why wouldn't he just go, you know what, man, like, I'm done. I'm out. Because Paul's steady purpose. In verse 19, my little children, for whom I am again in the anguish of childbirth until Christ is formed in you. And you may say to yourself, like, give it up, Paul. They're not listening to you, man. Haven't you ever read Boundaries by Cloud and Townsend? Like, give it up, say no so they can walk away. That may be a thing that you have thought, not that I would. And Paul may have given up at some point, but it wasn't before writing of this great cause that Christ be formed in them. So here's my plea for us. Like, if you call this church your home, or if you don't and you're kind of still trying to figure out what that looks like, I want you to know this. The elders, deacons, the neighborhood group leaders that lead you are purposed for one thing. Not uniformity, not anything else besides Christ being formed in you. That is the main purpose of everything that we do. The underlying foundation and bedrock behind everything that we do is that Christ be formed in you. Because we know if Christ be formed in you, then you will go out and make disciples. You will go out and love the world as God has loved you. You will go and do and love your neighbor as Christ has loved you. We will do these things if Christ be formed in us. I want you to know this as well. Like, look at the deep anguish that Paul had. I am again in the anguish of childbirth. So I've never given birth. Big shocker, but I've watched it 3 times. And there's a deep anguish with childbirth, yes?
Amen.
Okay, all right. Very good. I knew I would get an amen from the ladies, and the men are like, I don't know what you're talking about. Like, you know, when you're in the room and the deep anguish of childbirth is happening, that there is a laboring for something to be born, that what was started and unseen, I want to now see the fruit of all the pain that I've been going through for the last 9 or 10 months, that this beautiful journey would come to an end and another would begin, that the fruit, truly the fruit of the womb would now be enjoyed, doted over, right? And that's the kind of journey that Paul is in, and any good spiritual leader will be in for his people or her people. Like, I remember when Melissa gave birth to Moses, the doctor was having a burger down the street, not in the room, like down the street at some place, and he wasn't in the room. And I remember how disorienting her pain was. Her pain was so disorienting for me that I went over to the little thing and I grabbed blue gloves, and I was like, doctor's not here, I'm in it. I'm in it to win it. And the nurse looked at me and she goes, so what are you doing? And I was like, I'm ready to help. And she was like, no, you're not. You stand over there. And I was like, no problem. I'll take these off and hold a hand. Be like, you got this, girl. But I was ready to take the place of the main person that just was not there. Right? It was her pain was disorienting for me to the point where I wanted to help in any way I possibly could. And I had no skill set to do any of it. I was like, okay, yeah, it's fine. Yeah, we can do this. I'm sure it's on YouTube or something. Let's do this thing. I sat in the corner and tried not to cry is basically what happened with all the pain that was going on. Right? So there's a disorientation to pain, and yet when we know that this kind of pain, that there's a goal to it, it's worth it. That's the kind of pain that Paul's in. That's the kind of pain that I would say, like, that's the kind of pain that Jesus came to give his life for, so that we would be formed. That the baby inside of the baby Jesus that we just all worship would grow up inside of us. And that which was lost at the fall, the image of God that we were born into, somehow became distorted. That now God's purpose throughout all of time is to restore his image in us. that Christ be formed in us and that baby Jesus grows up into big man Jesus inside of us. We're no longer afraid of simple and small things, but instead courageously walking after him. Man, Paul's deepest and steadied purpose for us. So as we end, 2 questions. First, do you find yourself relying on knowing God, or do you find yourself relying on being known by God? And if you don't see a big deal in that, then I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's the former rather than the latter. That if we rely on really good things like Bible reading and prayer and baptism and communion and spiritual gifts or whatever it may be that get us right with God, having certain things that Paul calls that slavery. And it may not be discernible, right? So how do you know? How do you know that you're relying on little things that you do? So the job that you're praying for, the interview that you're going on, when a new opportunity raises up and you're thinking, man, like, I better not mess up in my spiritual life so that God doesn't take that away from me. That would be an example of how we rely on our own good behavior to get more of God. I better not mess up, otherwise God's going to take that away from me. Now, I'm not saying don't pursue holy and righteous things, but don't do it to get something from God. That's manipulation instead of worship. And so there's this subtlety, and yet it's a huge chasm in between, right? Or maybe if something doesn't work out, your first instance or your first thought process is, man, what did I do wrong? How did I mess up? Maybe you didn't do anything wrong. Maybe God just didn't want that for you. Maybe he's got a different plan for you. It may not be better in your eyes, but it's different because you know why? Because Christ is going to be formed in you along the way. Maybe there was something in that path that you so desperately wanted that God didn't want for you because it was not going to be a thing that Christ would form in you. So will we have a deep abiding trust? So do you find yourself relying on knowing God or being known by God? And the second question I have for us is, do you labor like Paul for the sake of another? Do you labor like Paul for the sake of another's spiritual formation? Do you labor in prayer and in conversation, risking relationship for the sake of Christ being formed in another? Paul's model for ministry was to lovingly labor for another, that he would risk being rejected, right? He would risk his relationships. He wasn't interested in finding his tribe. He wasn't interested in finding his people. Because he knows that's not the goal. Instead, the goal is whatever relationship God gives him along the way, he's going to lead in such a way that Christ be formed in him and in them. In summary, I will read this quote to you from a guy by the name of Tim Keller, a retired pastor out of New York City, probably one of the greatest modern teachers of our day. And he says this about this kind of leader. He says this about this kind of purpose, that Christ be formed in us as a people. He says, the gospel frees us, and this is the big thing, right? We don't want to pursue these relationships because we're afraid of all kinds of rejection and all kinds of things that come out of that. Most of us just summarize it as drama. But he says this, the gospel frees us from the need for people's approval and adoration so that we can confront and anger the people that we love if that is what's best for them. You believe that? You believe that there are some things that it's worth angering another over? If you love a person so selfishly that you cannot risk their anger, you won't ever tell them the truth that they need to hear. If, on the other hand, you tell a person the truth they need, but with harshness and not with the agony of a lover, man, they will not listen. But if you speak the truth with lots of love, evident at the same time, there's a great change. It's actually a great chance that they will see that what you say will penetrate the heart and heal. A gospel-based ministry is marked by loving honesty, not spin, not image, and not flattery. And this kind of gospel ministry is costly to the minister. That's you. That's all of us. That we would purpose for Christ to be formed in one another. Not to be liked, not for there to just be peace and no ruffled feathers and no crazy waves in life, but instead that Christ be formed in us. And if that's our purpose, there will be trouble. There will be anguish. There will be failure. But there will be lots and lots of grace because that's the gospel for all of us, that Christ be formed in us. Let's pray. Lord Jesus, you came not to make bad people good, but to raise dead people to life. See, this is not about doing the right thing. This is about believing the right thing about the God who came to shape us into himself. So Lord, let us be freed up from the lies that penetrate our hearts that we have to perform a certain way in order for you to like us. That's not covenant. Covenant is, man, for better or worse. It's the things that we say in marriage. For better or worse, you're for us, God. You're not looking at our life and going, man, wish you'd have done that better. That prayer, that's not going to reach me. Instead, you have purpose to love us unconditionally, loyally, without fail. There's never a minute, never a second, never a nanosecond where you're not postured in a way that's for us. So would we rest assured that we are being led by a God? We believe in a God who may not make all the things smooth, but certainly purposes all the things so that Christ be formed. May we humbly submit to loving and living for you. And may we humbly submit to do so while also understanding that we are going to have to die to ourselves along the way. Lord, paint the vision over our church. That what would it look like for a community of believers, not just its leaders, but a community of believers to take this sort of posture. That we would labor for Christ to be formed in one another, not just our kids, and yes, for our spouses, but also for those that are in our neighborhood groups, our growth groups, those that we lead along the way, those that are leading us along the way. See, that's what purpose us to have hard questions, that Christ be formed. Will we commit to this kind of presence in one another's lives? Would you empower us to do this with curious and listening hearts, not judgmental hearts, curious hearts as to what, God, you're doing in our own lives, so that we want to be made aware of more and more as we journey. Would you help us by your mercy, according to your will and grace? In Christ's name we pray. Amen.